Have you ever wondered what it feels like to discover that the person who once vowed to love you is now plotting your murder? In the quiet suburbs of a peaceful neighborhood, Susan's story begins not with the violent clash of a hammer against flesh, but with something far more insidious, a handwritten note from her ex-husband Mike. Sue, haven't been sleeping. Had to get away. Went to the beach. Just losing it. Don't know what to do. Love me. These words, scrawled on paper and left on her kitchen table, would later reveal themselves as the prelude to an orchestrated attempt on her life. That morning, as Susan stepped into her home, the familiar beep of her security system offered a false sense of safety. The shadows in her bedroom seemed longer than usual, the morning sunlight conspicuously absent. But it wasn't until she crossed the threshold of her bedroom that the true horror of Mike's manipulation came to light. There, lurking behind her door, stood Ed, a stranger in yellow rubber gloves, wielding a claw hammer with deadly intent. What followed was a 14-minute battle for survival that would expose the darkest depths of betrayal. As Susan fought for her life against a hired killer, she couldn't have known that the real architect of her intended death was the same man who had left that seemingly troubled note. The man who had once shared her bed, her dreams, and her trust. This is not just a story of survival against a violent intruder. It's a chilling testament to how quickly love can turn to malice, and how the bonds of marriage can transform into chains of betrayal. Susan's tale forces us to question, how well do we really know the people we let into our lives? And what happens when the greatest threat comes not from a stranger, but from the person we once called beloved? In emergency room of Providence Portland Medical Center in 1988, a dedicated nurse named Susan was immersed in her work. With her stethoscope draped around her neck, she moved swiftly from patient to patient, delivering medications and discussing care plans with doctors. At 33 years old, Susan thrived in the fast-paced environment, finding joy in helping others. Yet, deep inside, she felt a stirring desire for something more, a chance to find love and adventure outside the walls of the hospital. One evening, after another long shift, Susan decided to take a bold step. She picked up a pen and wrote a personal ad for the local newspaper. This was the 1988 version of Swiping Right. In her ad, she described herself as a single white female, 33, overweight but not over life, inviting anyone who shared her zest for life and love for exploring the beautiful Northwest to reach out. Much to her surprise, Susan received a response from a man named Mike Kuhnhausen. When she met him, he wasn't exactly what she had imagined. He was stocky with a beard and long sandy hair, wearing oversized glasses that made him look a bit quirky. But as they spent time together, Susan discovered that Mike shared her interests and had a passion for nature and beach outings. They laughed and explored together, and Susan found herself enchanted by his adventurous spirit. However, beneath Mike's charming exterior lay shadows from his past. He was divorced and had 2 children from that marriage. While this didn't deter Susan, Mike's bitterness about his divorce began to seep into their relationship. He viewed his failed marriage as a mark of shame and harbored resentment towards his ex-wife, believing that his ex-wife had taken advantage of him financially. This lingering bitterness raised some warning signs for Susan, though they weren't outright red flags, just things to keep an eye on. Despite these concerns, Susan remained optimistic. Having witnessed countless miraculous recoveries in her emergency room career, she believed that Mike could overcome his struggles too. On December 11, 1988, in a moment filled with hope and love, Susan became Mrs. Kuhnhausen. In the early years of their marriage, life seemed bright. They shared countless adventures, from birdwatching to butterfly spotting, and even enjoyed a beautiful trip along the Oregon coast, where the waves crashed joyfully against the shore. But every so often, those warning signs Susan had noticed began to creep back into their lives. Mike's negativity would bubble to the surface, especially when things didn't go as he wished. He often felt like the world was conspiring against him, and his obsession with money grew stronger. This fixation on finances became the first real red flag for Susan. She cherished experiences and relationships far more than material possessions, preferring to spend her hard-earned money on meaningful moments rather than things. In stark contrast, Mike placed immense value on wealth and material items. For instance, while he criticized Susan for spending money on a simple movie outing, he was secretly investing large sums into a collection of sports memorabilia. Old baseball cards, jerseys, and autographed gloves that he believed would one day be worth a fortune. Susan felt uneasy about his delusions surrounding this collection. What troubled her even more was how much time Mike spent locked away in the basement obsessing over it. He seemed to be withdrawing from the world around him, transforming into someone she hardly recognized. The adventurous man she had fallen in love with during their nature explorations was fading away. This isolation didn't seem healthy for either him or their marriage, and it left Susan feeling increasingly worried about their future together. Susan felt a growing unease as she tried to talk to Mike about her concerns. She noticed him pulling away and gently asked what was wrong. When he seemed hesitant to open up, she suggested he see a therapist for help. But Mike stubbornly refused to admit anything was wrong with him, instead finding faults in everyone else around him. This tendency to blame others for his problems made it increasingly difficult for Susan to be near him. If Mike was angry, it was always someone else's fault. If Susan felt unhappy, he dismissed her feelings as mere nagging. Rather than push the issue further, Susan decided to let it go and focus on what she could control. She accepted Mike's new interests and tried to show her love and support, encouraging him to get out more and spend time with her and her friends. She held on to the hope that with the right care, he would heal and return to the man she had once fallen in love with. For 17 long years, she nurtured that hope. Sadly, as time passed, Mike's behavior took a darker turn. He began to grow suspicious of Susan, convinced that, like his ex-wife, she would leave him and take all their money. It didn't matter that most of their income came from Susan's job as a nurse. Mike had various odd jobs but rarely earned as much as she did. This financial disparity may have fueled his insecurity and bitterness. Mike felt cheated out of a fair chance at life. Although they rarely discussed it, he had served in Vietnam and opened up about his experiences only once during their entire marriage. Those memories haunted him, perhaps adding to the weight of his anger and distrust. As Susan watched the man she loved transform into someone consumed by suspicion and resentment, her heart ached for the connection they once shared. On one fateful day, Mike finally opened up to Susan about his haunting experiences in Vietnam. He shared stories of long-range patrols and recounted a day when his team was ordered to attack a village, believing it was filled with enemies. But when they arrived, Mike was faced with a heartbreaking sight: children playing innocently. He never revealed what happened next, but Susan could see the pain in his eyes. It still haunted him deeply. Concerned for his well-being, she suggested he talk to someone at the vet center or veteran affairs, fearing he might have PTSD. Yet, Mike stubbornly refused, insisting he didn't need therapy because he had his own way of dealing with those painful memories. He claimed he would simply lock them away in a room and throw away the key. From her experience as a nurse, Susan knew that this approach wouldn't truly help him. By 2005, after 16 years of trying to make their marriage work, she felt she was reaching the end of her rope. Mike seemed unwilling to put in the effort to heal. He continued to withdraw and rejected her attempts to support him. His increasing anger worried her even more. His outbursts seemed to erupt out of nowhere and often targeted Susan. Fearing they were heading toward domestic violence, Susan decided it was time for a change. Around the holidays, she told Mike he needed to move out, and he complied. For the first time in years, Susan felt a wave of relief wash over her. She could finally breathe again. Although she had asked him to leave, she hadn't entirely given up on him. She didn't necessarily want to reconcile but hoped they could avoid an ugly divorce. She continued to reach out to Mike, inviting him to friendly gatherings and even trusting him with the code to her home security system, now her home alone. Despite everything, a flicker of hope remained in her heart that perhaps one day they could find peace. The alarm code for Susan's home had always been a reminder of their love. Their anniversary, December 11th, 88. Even after asking Mike to leave, she didn't change it, holding on to the hope that distance would allow him to heal. Unfortunately, that hope was misplaced. Mike managed to put on a convincing front, appearing fine and trustworthy to Susan. But when he was alone, a storm of rage brewed inside him. He felt like a failure in marriage for the second time, directing his anger at Susan just as he had at his first wife. As time passed, Mike became increasingly convinced that Susan had kicked him out to sabotage him during the divorce. Determined not to let that happen again, he twisted his thoughts into a dark plan. The only way to avoid losing face, money, and his beloved sports memorabilia collection was to murder Susan before she could finalize their divorce. This chilling mindset stemmed from his fears about finances rather than any genuine concern for their relationship. To him, it didn't matter if she found happiness with someone else. All he could think about was what he stood to lose. Living in a victim mindset, Mike felt justified in his sinister thoughts. After months of separation, he began plotting how he would kill Susan before she could finalize their divorce. Having likely faced violence before in combat, he may not have hesitated at the thought of committing such an act against her. The darkness within him grew stronger, and with each passing day, the line between right and wrong blurred further in his mind. Mike knew that if Susan turned up dead, the police would look at him first. They were in the middle of a divorce, and since she made more money than he did, he had to be clever about his plan. For a while, he considered making it look like an accident. He repeatedly invited Susan to the beach, hoping she might fall off a cliff, but she always declined. Desperate for a new strategy, Mike's story took an unexpected turn. He worked as the maintenance supervisor for a chain of adult novelty stores called Fantasy Adult Video. Part of his job involved hiring and firing custodial staff. One day, a man recently released from prison came in to apply for a cleaning position. This man, Ed Hay, casually mentioned that he had been incarcerated for conspiracy to commit murder. Mike must have felt stunned. It seemed like fate had dropped an opportunity right into his lap. After hiring Ed, he learned even more about him. Ed had served 10 years for hiring a hitman to torture and murder his ex-girlfriend. He also had prior convictions for robbery and assault and struggled with an addiction to crack cocaine. While not the kind of person you'd want working for your business, he was exactly the type of person Mike could consider for a dirty job. Quickly, Mike struck up a friendship with Ed. He went out of his way to get close to him, discovering they shared common ground. Both had served in the military and felt like the world was against them. They were both narcissists who blamed others for their problems. With their negativity feeding off each other, it didn't take long for Mike to open up and share his dark thoughts with Ed. They found themselves openly discussing their desire to murder someone, revealing just how far Mike was willing to go to protect himself from losing everything he held dear. Mike confided in Ed about his belief that Susan was planning to screw him over in their divorce. He expressed his determination not to be the victim this time. In a moment of desperation, he offered Ed a staggering $50,000 to murder Susan, claiming it was much more than others might pay. Ed reacted with skepticism, saying he wouldn't do it for that amount, but Mike insisted he was serious. He proposed paying half up front and half upon completion. Ed, having been down this road before, might have wondered where Mike would get such money. As it turned out, Mike's job as a maintenance supervisor at the adult novelty store paid well. In addition to his salary and benefits, he received a holiday bonus of $4,000 or $5,000 each year. When he brought it home, he told Susan he only got $1,000 and contributed that to their joint account while hiding the rest. This deception allowed Mike to save a significant amount, enough to give Ed the upfront payment of $25,000 and promise another $25,000 upon completion of the job. Ed agreed, and just like that, Mike's sinister plan was in motion. On September 6, 2006, Mike drove Ed to the home where Susan now lived alone in southeast Portland. He let Ed into the house using the alarm code from their anniversary. Then he reset the alarm to bypass mode, allowing Ed to move around inside while the system remained armed. Before leaving, Mike placed a note for Susan in the mudroom and checked into a motel room by the beach to set up an alibi. He waited there for Ed to call and tell him it was done. Meanwhile, Susan was hard at work at Providence Medical Center. After a long 9-hour shift in the ER, she headed home, completely unaware of the danger lurking within her own walls. Trusting Mike completely, she kept the alarm code the same and gave him the benefit of the doubt throughout their troubled relationship. It must have been incredibly confusing and heartbreaking for Susan to learn that someone she loved was trying to kill her. As she walked into her home, the familiar beep of the security system signaled that it was armed. She turned off the alarm and then noticed Mike's note. Earlier that day, he had called to say he was going to the beach, so she felt puzzled but not entirely surprised by the note he left. Sue, haven't been sleeping. Had to get away. Went to the beach. Just losing it. Don't know what to do. Love me. With a pang of sympathy for her ex, she set the note aside and headed to her bedroom to change. As she walked down the hallway, an uneasy feeling washed over her. The bedroom was dark, which was strange because Susan always opened the curtains in the morning to let in light. She wondered if she had simply forgotten that day. Shrugging off her discomfort, she continued into the bedroom. Suddenly, a man stepped out from behind the door. It was Ed, but Susan had no idea who he was. All she saw was a scraggly-looking man wearing yellow rubber gloves and holding a claw hammer. Reacting on instinct, she blurted out, "Who are you? What are you doing here? What do you want?" The man didn't respond. Instead, he swung the hammer at her head, striking her on the temple. At 51 years old, Susan fought back fiercely, wrestling with what she assumed was a burglar. She shoved him against the wall, desperately trying to wrestle the hammer away from him. Throughout the struggle, Susan expected him to demand jewelry or ask for the safe code, but he didn't say anything at all. As they grappled, doubt crept into her mind. Was this man really a burglar? She fought for her life while her thoughts raced in confusion about who he was and why he was there. Eventually, using all her strength, she managed to pin him against the wall. In that moment, their eyes locked, and he uttered the only words he spoke during this entire terrifying encounter. "You're strong." When Ed told Susan, "You're strong," it felt both creepy and unsettling. Here he was, trying to kill her, yet surprised by her fierce resistance. Susan sensed his twisted excitement, which only made her stomach churn as she realized he was there to end her life. In that moment, a fierce determination surged within her. She thought, "You are not going to kill me in my own home." All the anger she had suppressed during her marriage came rushing back, fueling her fight for survival. With a sudden burst of strength, Susan wrapped her hands around Ed's throat, still gripping the hammer he had used against her. She squeezed tightly as he struggled against her grip, but she held firm, using her weight to pin him against the wall. As his face began to turn blue and he gasped for air, she felt an empowering rush. Finally, Ed released his grip on the hammer. Seizing the opportunity, Susan let go of his neck and grabbed the weapon for herself. She remembered something her father had taught her. If anyone broke into their home, she could defend herself with a hammer. He had advised using the claw end for maximum effectiveness. With that knowledge in mind, Susan flipped the hammer and began striking Ed with it. Her father's advice proved invaluable. It was an effective weapon. However, after a few desperate strikes, the hammer slipped from her hand due to the fear and adrenaline coursing through her. Instead of picking it up again, she decided to escape. She turned and ran, screaming for her neighbors to call 911. Ed, injured but determined not to go to prison for attempted murder, chased after her. He caught up with her in the hallway and grabbed her from behind, spinning her around and starting to punch her in the face. By this point, their struggle felt like it had lasted longer than a UFC match. Both were utterly exhausted. Susan fell to the floor, drained of strength and only a few feet away from the phone. She thought there was no way she could reach it. Hearing footsteps behind her on the hardwood floor, she looked back to see Ed standing over her again. He still wore those rubber gloves and had retrieved the hammer. As he raised it to deliver what could be a fatal blow, Susan felt another surge of rage and adrenaline flood through her. "He is not going to kill me," she thought fiercely. In a desperate move, Susan lunged for Ed's legs, grabbing his calves and yanking his feet out from under him. He fell to the floor, and they wrestled fiercely for control of the hammer. Susan screamed until her voice was hoarse, but no one came to help. Where were the neighbors? Amidst the chaos, she decided to fight back even harder. Thinking that if he killed her, her bite marks and saliva could identify him, She bit Ed several times on the arms and thighs, targeting areas that would hurt. But despite her efforts, he still wouldn't let go of the hammer. Just when Susan thought she might never regain control of the weapon, she had another idea. With one last surge of strength, she managed to get Ed onto his stomach. Climbing onto him, she wrapped her arms around his neck in a chokehold. This tactic had worked for her before, and Ed began thrashing wildly beneath her. As she choked him from behind, she pleaded, "Tell me who you are, and I will call you an ambulance." But Ed never responded. After a few agonizing minutes, he slumped down motionless. Susan staggered to her feet, grabbed the hammer, and ran with all her remaining strength through her neighbor's house. 14 minutes had passed since the attack began. A long struggle for survival against a grown man with a hammer. She waited on her neighbor's porch as police and paramedics arrived. Despite her exhaustion, adrenaline surged through her veins, keeping her alert. When a police officer approached her, she asked if the man who had attacked her was dead. The officer confirmed it. Susan took this in but was suddenly flooded with emotion. Not relief as one might expect, but deep grief. She hadn't woken up that day planning to kill someone. Even while fighting for her life, she felt a profound sorrow for Ed. She thought about how he probably had a family of his own and how things could have turned out so differently if only he had chosen another path. Susan believed that everyone has someone in the world who loves them, and she was sure this man was no different. Someone would soon be mourning for him. Yet, she had no idea who he was or what he wanted, though she had a pretty good idea of who had sent him. As she distanced herself from the attack, it struck her that this man had entered her home while the security system was armed. There was only one person who could disarm it and then rearm it to allow him inside. Someone she had once loved. Mike had been on vacation, or whatever you might call it, while Ed waited for hours to hear from him about how the job had gone. Still at the motel by the beach, Mike eventually turned on the TV and was shocked to see his house on the news. It was clear something terrible had happened, but the reporters weren't providing enough details. Mike wondered if Susan had been found dead or if Ed had completed his mission. To find out, he called Providence Medical Center, where Susan worked, asking if she was there. The staff replied that they didn't know. The truth was that Susan was indeed there, as a patient in the same emergency room where she worked. Fearing that Mike might come for her again, she had instructed everyone not to reveal her presence. Meanwhile, Mike remained oblivious to what was happening. In his frustration, he tried calling Susan's friends and eventually reached a woman named Helen. Helen had known Susan for many years and harbored serious concerns about Mike. So much so that when Mike tried to take Susan to the beach, Helen warned her not to be alone with him because they were separated and his intentions were unclear. Helen's instincts about Mike were strong, and now they weighed heavily on her mind as she worried about her friend's safety in light of recent events. Receiving a call from Mike at almost 2 o'clock in the morning made Helen feel uneasy. She listened warily as Mike babbled, sounding almost manic. He repeated over and over, "I was at the beach. I've been at the beach. I was in a motel at the beach, and I saw the house on the news. I can't reach Susan. Do you know what's going on?" Helen told Mike she didn't know what was happening and hung up. However, she became convinced that Mike knew more than he let on. If he was at the beach, why not just drive to his house to see what was going on? The next day, Helen accompanied Susan back to her house after she was released from the hospital. Although it was still a crime scene, police allowed her to pick up a few personal items. While there, Helen noticed something unusual. Mike's sports memorabilia collection was boxed up by the door. It appeared that the hitman was supposed to take it and give it to Mike, making it look like a burglary gone wrong. As Helen continued to look around, she spotted a backpack that seemed out of place, and Susan confirmed it wasn't hers. Police officers opened it up and found a day planner belonging to Ed, the now-dead hitman. This discovery helped them identify him. He had left his backpack behind, likely intending to take it when he left but never had the chance. Inside the day planner, they found a note dated September 4th, just 2 days before the attack, that read, "Call Mike." They also discovered Mike's cell phone number scrawled inside one of the folders. This must have been a devastating blow for Susan. She had suspected Mike's involvement, but now had undeniable proof that the man she had invested 17 years of her life in wanted her dead. The police were convinced and prepared to arrest Mike, charging him with conspiracy to commit murder. At this point, nobody knew where he was, but Susan had a good idea. The beach had always been a refuge for Mike, a place where he could clear his head. However, as hours passed and the reality of his failed plans set in, Mike realized he probably couldn't go home anymore. If his plan had failed and Ed was dead, he knew he had made a grave mistake that could cost him everything. Ed, the hitman, had made a critical mistake that exposed Mike. Leaving a note that pointed police directly to him, Mike went on the run for several days, trying to devise a plan. Luckily for Susan, Mike was spotted before he could make his next move. On September 15, 2006, just days after the attempted murder, he was arrested. He insisted he was innocent and told police he was suicidal. Mike's daughter from his first marriage claimed he had left a suicide note, but whether it was real or just another ploy like the note he left for Susan didn't help his case. He was charged with conspiracy to commit aggravated murder, just like Ed had been over 10 years earlier. In January 2007, his daughter managed to raise the money to get him released on house arrest. However, the landlord refused to let him stay there, so back to jail he went. This brought relief to Susan, who felt she was living with 2 life sentences. The pain of knowing Mike had tried to kill her and the pain of having taken someone's life. During his September 2007 sentencing hearing, Susan addressed Mike directly. Looking into the eyes of the man she once loved, she said, "As long as you live, I will never have a measure of peace, but I will not be destroyed." While Mike was sentenced to 10 years in prison, Susan dedicated herself to helping others during that time. She became an outspoken advocate for victims of violent crime and started several organizations to assist them. She even created a website where people in her county could check the status of their cases and find information about offenders. The thought of someone hiring a hitman to kill her was terrifying. How could she be sure it wouldn't happen again? A restraining order wouldn't stop someone determined to harm her. In 2015, Susan learned that Mike would be released early. To protect herself, she changed her name and moved. As a victim who almost died, she had to change her identity, a devastating necessity for her safety. She took additional precautions by putting gravel outside her house so she could hear anyone approaching and installed security cameras. She even began taking lessons at a shooting range. Years later, Susan continued to grapple with the reality that she had been forced to take a life in self-defense. But Susan wasn't ashamed. She knew that if the need arose again, she would be ready. Fortunately, that moment never came because Mike died of prostate cancer just a few months before his early release. When she learned of her ex-husband's death, Susan expressed mixed feelings. She said, "I don't mourn his passing. Instead, I mourn the life he could have had if only he could have opened his heart to those of us who cared about him." Despite everything she had been through, Susan remained true to herself. She no longer loved her ex-husband when he died, but she would always wish she could have saved him. This is the story of Susan Kuhnhausen. It's unimaginable to think that someone you love could try to kill you,